to just ask you your, I guess, opinion that the God hypothesis is a useless cope. By God hypothesis, do you mean just merely that God exists?
No, like the explanation of like the how do I say this? Saying God is the explanation for pretty much anything
God is the explanation
because
of anything.
it doesn't actually explain anything. And at the end of the day, somebody can just claim, well, and this kind of goes with the faith thing, like, well, I believe that it was done this way by this God. And somebody says,
Hmm.
well, I believe it was done a different way by a different God. And somebody says, well, I believe that gods are actually non interventionist, but they exist and blah, blah, blah. Um, so that's what I mean.
That's interesting. So, in that sort of point, then you wouldn't be opposed to a God existing, but not necessarily being tied to any particular religion. Just God is a transcendent being. You have uh, I guess, hypothetical different definition of God compared to, like, I guess, what most mainstream religions have. Would that make sense? What is your
Maybe. I
view?
don't know.
Well, I mean, just what is your opinion? I'm curious.
About what God is?
Yeah, what God potentially be? Are you completely opposed to the idea of a God existing? Like, I don't know if you're
No,
atheist or
it
not.
could, but I don't think even in principle you'd ever have any good reason to believe in it um, or to say that it's responsible for X, Y, or Z.
Okay. I mean, I think I could tackle it from that point then. I do think there is value to human beings believing something that's transcendent, and we just put a label of it as God. My views, I'm stating this agnostic of my own views, but I think you would be kind of hard pressed to try to decouple God from the development of philosophy to development of natural sciences, our knowledges of them. Because I do feel like that sort of optimism or just comfort, you can say it's a cope, I guess. And I don't think there's anything wrong with it being a cope, but I do think that as humans evolve, as our knowledge progresses, the idea of a God kind of obviously transforms of what is possible of it because once we sort of advance natural sciences, our knowledges of them in different fields, we can kind of get a better perspective of what's possible, or at least virtually what's possible versus impossible. So I kind of feel like God in the idea of it or something transcendent beyond us is kind of not necessarily guiding, but it sort of keeps us grounded in the sense of continuing to be curious. I feel like this is more philosophical discussion, and even then, like, this is not my realm of expertise, but philosophically, if we say there is no God, I feel like that is kind of closing the doors, even though we don't have enough evidence to completely disprove a God. I don't think like the mainstream theories of like anything that science can present necessarily completely negates the idea of a God. I don't feel like if it did, I feel like there would be a very linear argument to say God doesn't exist, and that's not necessarily the case. There's conflicting arguments when people start to bring up like, oh, creation theory and all that, but even then, I feel like that makes the discussion a little bit siloed. Does that make sense?
I mean, sort of, but at the end of the day, if we ascribe to the God hypothesis, what do we do with that information?
I don't think it's necessarily anything along the lines of solutions that it provides us. I think it's more so just keeping the door open to possibilities in a purely philosophical way. I don't think like it would be necessarily productive to completely say that there's no transcendent being beyond us because we're not operating with enough information to really ascertain that as a yes or no. um because
So,
also to the fact that like where religion often comes from, most people are not operating with enough information, either from a theological perspective or from a scientific education perspective, to really know where theories or like ideas compare and contrast directly. And I feel like more or less everyone is deferring to some sort of authority or people that obviously know much more than them on a particular subject, either in material sciences or religion, and they kind of just follow along with the crowd to be a dogma. So I feel like unless there's a very linear argument presented by one side that is supported by evidence, that whether or not God exists, we would never get to a place necessarily where we can say one way or another. So therefore, religion has a place of at least guiding people through curiosity of being understanding of where we come from. And I don't think necessarily it would be wise to sort of try to decouple that and looking at the history of like the humanities and developments of arts and sciences to say whether or not basically, oh, science is our only guiding principle of how we understand the things around us. Because science, you cannot completely decouple it from philosophy. I don't think so. It's interesting, like if you look at the writings of famous physicists, like a lot of them not don't aren't necessarily completely like agnostic or atheist. They do recognize that religion is kind of like a part of their journey and like how they even get curious enough about their fields to ask certain questions that inspire them to, be physicists or experts in whatever particular field. Um, Ultimately, I feel like it's part of the human experience, just as
Okay.
a curiosity of knowledge is.
Okay. So when you said that saying there is no God is closing a door, basically,
Hmm.
you said that, right?
Hmm.
I think that that is fundamentally backwards because let's say we have an unsolved problem. On the
Hmm.
one hand, we could say God did it. On the other hand, we could say it was something other than that. If we go with the God hypothesis, we can't do anything with that hypothesis other than accept it. We could perhaps come up with some like logical arguments for it, but at the end of the day, all we're doing is trying to find premises to validate a conclusion we already came up with. That's not useful epistemologically at all. If yeah, it does
Hmm.
nothing but validate our feelings. Whereas if we assume, like, you can even believe that God did it. But what you should do is you should do everything you can to try to disprove that claim. Because even if you fail at trying to provide some sort of alternative explanation, at least you have a rigorous justification for this alternative idea. Now, I still kind of think that I don't know about rigorous because that kind of sounds like a argument from ignorance a little bit. But yeah, I just think that that's totally backwards for those reasons.
I actually agree, with what you're saying in the sense of it's much more constructive for us to be able to make observations of the world around us and build towards whether or not we have a reasonable conclusion of ascertaining whatever thing. But the only thing I disagree with there is if we say God did it, that doesn't necessarily prevent us from, having or just, from my understanding of this, utilizing scientific method to understand the world around us. We can put God in some order, people who are religious, put God in sort of a transcendent, other, completely, entirely other place where the physical world around us that we're able to observe is within our ability, and God is completely something else. You made an interesting point, and it's kind of like related to this earlier, where you said it doesn't really make sense to try to explain God with science. And as someone who's religious, I completely agree with that. Even on a fundamental, like very formal logic level, I don't think you can apply formal logic to God because, for example, cause and effect, oh, necessarily God can't create himself, or God does create himself, or he or she, or whatever. If the thing exists beyond that sort of framework of our minds of how we even make if or and statements, then how could we ever ascertain anything about a God? Which means our physical world, in sense, exists outside or in a much more subservient level to whatever perspective a God does have. Like, does that do you get what I mean? Like the physical world and what we observe around us, anything we can ascertain doesn't necessarily, it's not possible if you believe in a god to say that negates God, assuming we go with the theory that God exists, the God hypothesis. Get what I'm saying?
Maybe a little bit. Let me just illustrate an example. For centuries, when pandemics happened, people assumed the Jews did it. People assumed it was a curse. People assumed that because they were not righteous enough. People assumed it was because they sinned too much.
Hmm.
That they or whatever. Those are all God hypotheses, and
Hmm.
they're useless because they're not even testable, right? The real answer was something completely different. And if we just sat around with our various God hypotheses, we would never have arrived at the real conclusion. Now, you can go ahead and believe that the plague of Justinian really actually was like one of the plagues of Egypt. It was literally fundamentally unknowable. It was something mysterious. It wasn't caused by a bacteria or a virus or anything like that. It just simply was the divine work of God. You can go ahead and believe that forever. But what about future events? Well, let's assume that that wasn't that perhaps wasn't. And what we find out is, we learn about like the germ theory of disease and communicable diseases and
Hmm.
pathology and viruses and all that. That doesn't really actually disprove the claim that the plague of Justinian was actually whatever, or the plagues of Egypt were not. So it doesn't
Hmm.
really disprove that, but it adds so much more value to what we understand now and what we can do now and what we can prevent happening in the future. That's
Hmm.
sort of my more broad overall point. We've kind of been on this for a while and have like 8 people that are waiting. So, like, if
Oh
you
no,
just
I
want to give a
totally
closing
understand, dude.
remark,
No, it's no problem. I appreciate the time that you let me came up, and it was nice discussing this with you. Appreciate it.
you're welcome.